Welcome back to Mr. Wisdom's story, where tales of courage, kindness, and life-changing moments are told with heartfelt sincerity. Today, we take you to a quiet roadside gas station on a blazing sunny afternoon. Here, an unexpected encounter unfolds into a profound lesson about the power of integrity and the resilience to rise above prejudice. Our protagonist, a black soldier named Ethan Carter, is on his way home to reunite with his family after months of separation. But this seemingly peaceful stop suddenly becomes the stage for a tense confrontation, where the true measure of a man is revealed. If you love meaningful stories with surprising twists, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss a story from Mr. Wisdom's story. Now, sit back and join us for this deeply moving tale. It was an unusually quiet afternoon at a gas station along the highway. Cars passed by occasionally, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the faint hum of fuel pumps in their wake. Everything felt too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Standing at one of the pumps was Ethan Carter. A tall, broad-shouldered man with deep, dark skin, likely in his early 30s. He wore an old camouflage uniform that stood out starkly against the setting. Yet one detail seemed out of place, a pair of worn-out sneakers, scuffed and frayed from years of tough wear. To Ethan, those shoes weren't just footwear, they were a symbol of comfort and freedom after the harsh demands of serving on faraway battlefields. Today, his mind was flooded with thoughts of home, the cozy kitchen, his mother's warm cooking, and the tight embrace of his younger sister. It had been far too long since Ethan had felt the love and comfort of his family. As he twisted the gas cap on his beat-up car, the roar of engines shattered the stillness. A group of motorcycles, ridden by older men, sped into the station. Their worn leather jackets were adorned with patches symbolizing loyalty to an old veterans club. The rumble of their engines didn't just drown out the quiet, it was a provocative declaration. Ethan stood silently, his gaze calm yet alert. He didn't know that he was about to face scrutinizing stares, loaded words, and a challenge to his dignity and pride. But what these men didn't realize was that Ethan carried within him a strong heart and an unyielding spirit, ready to prove that respect isn't earned through appearances but by standing tall in the face of adversity. Their weathered faces, lined with the grit of veteran life, reflected a hardened resolve. But today, they didn't carry the camaraderie or respect often shared among veterans. This group had their sights set on Ethan Carter, a man wearing a military uniform they didn't think he deserved. Chuck Ryder, the leader of the pack, a towering man with a thick silver beard and piercing eyes, parked his bike right next to Ethan. The rest of the group quickly followed, forming an unspoken but palpable circle of intimidation. The air grew heavy, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Chuck's gaze swept over Ethan from head to toe, dripping with contempt. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice deep and raspy, brimming with condescension. Ethan, still capping the fuel tank, looked up, his eyebrows knitting slightly in surprise. Chuck continued, "What's with the uniform? Trying to fake your way into some military discount?" Ethan straightened up, meeting the man's stare with calm resolve, though a flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" Chuck smirked coldly, revving his motorcycle as if to assert dominance. "You heard me. Don't tell me you think you can just throw that on, walk in here, and demand a discount. Look at you, those shoes don't even pass muster." Laughter rippled through the group behind him, a chorus of mockery. Ethan stayed composed. His eyes flicked to his worn-out sneakers, then back to Chuck. "First of all," he said, his tone measured but firm, "this gas station doesn't offer military discounts. Second, I'm not here for any discount. I'm here to fill my tank." Chuck wasn't satisfied. He snorted, taking a step closer. "Yeah, right. Like we're supposed to believe you're actually a soldier. No insignia, no medals. I'd bet that uniform came from some thrift store." Chuck's remark drew a louder burst of laughter from his crew, but the mood was no longer one of harmless ridicule. Ethan could feel the hostility intensify in the stares aimed his way. The quiet gas station now felt like a potential battleground. Inside the convenience store, a few patrons glanced out the window cautiously, sensing the tension. No one spoke loudly, but the unease in the air was unmistakable. Something dangerous was brewing. Ethan, no stranger to confrontations, sighed inwardly. He just wanted to get home, to avoid unnecessary trouble. But that didn't mean he would back down. "I served 3 tours overseas," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of conviction. "I don't have to prove anything to you." Chuck smirked again, stepping even closer. Ethan could now smell the faint staleness of tobacco clinging to the man. "If that's true," Chuck challenged, "then show us proof. If not, I'm calling the cops right now." Ethan didn't flinch, nor did he respond immediately. He stood his ground, his expression steady, as though weighing Chuck's words one by one. Deep down, Ethan knew his patience was being pushed to its limits, and any misstep could tip the situation into chaos. Inside the convenience store, the cashier glanced nervously toward the scene, their trembling hands hovering near the counter. Other customers lingered near the entrance, curiosity mixed with unease. The tension in the air felt like a taut string on the verge of snapping. Outside, the midday sun blazed, intensifying the oppressive atmosphere. Chuck leaned in closer, his presence and that of his companions forming an invisible wall of pressure around the young soldier. "What are you waiting for? Prove it," Chuck practically growled. All eyes were on Ethan, but he remained unfazed. This wasn't the first time he'd faced suspicion and pressure. But this time, it wasn't just about him, it was about what he represented: honor, integrity, and the resilience to stand against unfounded prejudice. The asphalt beneath their feet seemed to meld with the suffocating tension in the air. The bikers weren't just standing still anymore, they were shifting subtly, forming a loose circle around Ethan Carter, as though preparing for the confrontation to escalate. It was an unsettling sight, 6 rugged men, seasoned veterans, staring down Ethan as if he were the focus of their long-buried frustrations. Ethan wasn't unfamiliar with high-stakes situations. As a soldier, he had faced moments where a single wrong move could cost lives. He had learned to remain calm under pressure, to assess before acting. But this time was different. The blatant racism, the scornful insults from these men, these were wounds that cut deeper than any battlefield injury. Chuck Ryder, the leader of the group, sneered in disdain, his gray beard quivering as he spat out his next words. "Listen here, kid," Chuck said, his tone laced with bitterness. "I've seen real soldiers. Fought alongside them. And let me tell you straight, you don't look like a soldier to me. You think you can just throw on that uniform and call yourself one of us? Ridiculous." Ethan felt the heat rising within him, but he kept his face calm and steady. He could see Chuck's intentions clearly, the man was baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction. But Ethan wasn't about to fall into that trap. He quickly surveyed the surroundings, a few onlookers in the convenience store watching intently through the glass, the faint beeping of a distant gas pump, the hum of passing cars on the nearby highway. Yet all of it seemed distant compared to the immediate threat in front of him. One of the men in the group shouted, "Hey, where's your military ID? Show it to us, or is it missing?" Another man sneered, adding, "I bet you don't even know how to salute properly." The taunts grew more biting, but Ethan remained silent. He had no intention of lowering himself to engage with people who didn't deserve his respect or time. But Chuck wasn't about to stop. He closed the distance, his face now only inches away from Ethan's. "You think you can just put on that uniform, walk in here, and get away with impersonating someone? This isn't a video game, kid. This is real life. You don't belong in that uniform, and you sure as hell don't belong here." The final words hit Ethan like a blow, and the anger inside him began to simmer. But before he could react, Chuck lunged. His movement was clumsy and aggressive, his arm rising to grab Ethan's collar. Ethan didn't need time to think. His military training kicked in instantly. With a quick and precise step back, he dodged Chuck's attack, simultaneously grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back with a fluid motion. Chuck didn't have time to react. In a few seconds, he was locked in place, his arm twisted painfully behind him. Ethan held him in the position, his gaze calm but piercing. "I told you," Ethan said, his voice low and firm, "I don't need to prove anything to you. But if you want to keep challenging me, I'm ready." For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence, no one saying a word. The customers inside the convenience store stood frozen, eyes wide in disbelief. The sunlight blazed down on the scene, highlighting the contrast between Ethan's composed demeanor and Chuck's stunned, defeated posture. The pain was evident on Chuck Ryder's face as Ethan Carter expertly controlled him, pinning him to the hot concrete. The sight left the surrounding bikers motionless. Their leader, once imposing and tough, now lay on the ground, his teeth gritted as he endured the pain. The atmosphere at the gas station suddenly felt unnervingly quiet, as if even the distant bird songs could be heard clearly. Inside the convenience store, customers and staff watched through the glass, tension etched across their faces. A real storm was brewing, not from the weather, but from the confrontation unfolding before them. Ethan leaned down closer to Chuck, his gaze cold, though his voice remained steady and controlled. "I told you to back off," he said, each word deliberate and heavy. "You don't know who you're messing with." Chuck groaned, his face pressed against the scorching asphalt. The defiance had vanished, replaced by pain and panic. The bikers exchanged uncertain looks, as though trying to decide what to do next. No one dared move toward Ethan. The mocking words from earlier had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, palpable fear. Finally, one of them muttered, "We should leave," but Chuck, as always, refused to back down. Though in pain, he spat through clenched teeth, "Call the cops. This guy just attacked me. He's wearing a fake uniform, and I want him arrested right now." Ethan released Chuck's wrist and stood tall. Chuck slowly got to his feet, cradling his injured arm, but his eyes still burned with hatred. The bikers quickly surrounded him, as if to protect him, but none dared approach Ethan. One man took out his phone and dialed 911, his voice trembling but trying to sound tough. "We've got someone here, impersonating military personnel," he said into the phone. "We need the police right now." Ethan stood still, taking a deep breath, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this situation wasn't over. The police would arrive, and he'd have to face not only this group but any prejudice that might come his way. Sometimes, even when you're in the right, situations like this can turn into a battle you have to fight all over again. Time moved slowly. The harsh afternoon sun beat down, making the air feel even more stifling. The bikers quietly gathered around Chuck, who was still nursing his aching wrist. The tension in the air was thick, like a taut string waiting for the spark to set it off. Suddenly, the sound of a police siren pierced the silence, shattering the tension. A patrol car skidded into the gas station, its flashing lights cutting through the blue sky. Ethan turned his head, his gaze sharp. He knew that this moment would determine everything. Two officers stepped out of the car, a man and a woman. Both wore sunglasses and carried themselves with an air of authority. The scene before them, bikers with tense expressions and a man in a military uniform standing between them, made the air feel even heavier. Ethan took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was about to happen. He hadn't done anything wrong, but his past experiences had taught him that sometimes the truth isn't enough to protect yourself in situations like this. He looked directly at the two officers, standing his ground, ready to face whatever was coming next. The two officers cautiously approached the scene, their eyes scanning the large group of bikers, their leader clutching his wrist in pain, and a black man in military uniform standing tall by his car. The first officer, a tall man with broad shoulders, spoke in a calm but authoritative tone. We got a call about an altercation here. Can someone explain what happened? Chuck, despite clearly being in pain, seized the opportunity to take control of the situation. He stepped forward, pointing an accusatory finger at Ethan Carter, his voice filled with anger and calculation. "It's him!" Chuck shouted. "This guy's in uniform, but he's not a real soldier. When I called him out, he attacked me. We need to arrest him immediately for impersonating an officer." Both officers turned their gaze toward Ethan. Though his heart was pounding, Ethan kept his expression calm and resolute, his eyes never leaving theirs. The first officer, his face unreadable, asked, "Do you have anything to say about these accusations?" Ethan stepped forward, his voice low but clear, confident. "Officer, I didn't attack anyone. This man and his group confronted me because they thought I wasn't a real soldier. I tried to avoid conflict, but when he charged at me, I had no choice but to defend myself." The female officer gave the group of bikers a sharp look, her expression calculating. She asked, "Is that true?" The other bikers fidgeted, avoiding eye contact. Finally, one of them reluctantly muttered, "Yeah, he was just defending himself." But another one quickly interjected, his tone filled with frustration. "That doesn't mean he's not pretending. Who knows if he's really a soldier or not?" The first officer sighed, turning back to Ethan. "Do you have any proof that you've served in the military?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, officer. I have my uniform and insignia in my car." He pointed to the vehicle beside him, his voice steady but firm. "I came here after physical therapy. The uniform and boots are part of my recovery process after serving overseas. But with all due respect, I don't owe anyone an explanation for why I'm wearing this, especially not people like them." Ethan's words rang out strong, like thunder on a clear day. The bikers stood in stunned silence, confusion and guilt written all over their faces. Chuck, unable to meet Ethan's gaze, finally lowered his head. The two officers exchanged a silent look, a shared understanding between them. The first officer moved closer to Chuck, his voice dropping into a cold, serious tone. "You attacked this man without justification. That's assault, and I can't let that slide." Chuck's face turned pale. No. I didn't do that. I was just..." Before Chuck could make another excuse, the female officer cut him off. "Lucky for you, he's not pressing charges. But you still need to take responsibility for your actions." To the surprise of the bikers, Chuck was handcuffed and escorted to the patrol car. He struggled, but all his efforts were in vain. The tide had turned, and the man who had once been the aggressor now faced the unexpected consequences of his actions. Ethan stood there, silently observing. A sense of relief and justice surged within him. The tense situation had finally been resolved, and the truth had prevailed. He took a deep breath, as if releasing the weight that had been pressing on his shoulders for the past few minutes. As the officers prepared to leave, one of the bikers, the one who had taunted Ethan, stepped forward, his gaze filled with regret. He hesitated, his voice trembling. We didn't know, man. We didn't know what you've been through." Ethan looked at him, his expression softening, but his words still sharp. "Next time, think carefully before judging someone you don't understand." The man nodded and stepped back, while Ethan turned away, heading toward his car. He knew he had won, not just against the injustice, but also against the prejudice and challenges he'd faced. Ethan Carter sat down at the counter, the weariness from the event still lingering in his mind. When the server placed a hot cup of black coffee in front of him, she smiled warmly, her eyes full of concern. "You look like you've had a long day," she said gently, with a hint of empathy. Ethan smiled faintly, nodding, lifting the cup to his lips. The steam rising from the coffee, mingling with its rich aroma, seemed to dissipate some of the heaviness in his chest. "Yeah, you could say that. The server smiled kindly but didn't press further, allowing Ethan to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere of the small diner. Truck drivers in the corner quietly conversed, the clink of mugs creating a soothing rhythm that was in stark contrast to the tension Ethan had just endured at the gas station. His thoughts drifted back to the event. Chuck and his group had insulted not only his honor but his very identity, a man who had given his youth, his health, and his spirit to serve his country. Their unfounded accusations reminded him of countless times he had faced prejudice from those who didn't understand, or didn't care to. Ethan took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste helping to sharpen his mind. He recalled the words of his former commanding officer, who once said, "The biggest battles don't happen on the battlefield. They happen in the hearts and minds of those around us." Today, Ethan had fought such a battle. Not with ammunition or weapons, but with prejudice and ignorance. Yet, what weighed on him most wasn't Chuck's venomous words, but the question of whether that group had truly learned anything from this. Would they change the way they viewed him, and others like him, or would they continue to hold on to their biases? The doorbell rang, interrupting Ethan's thoughts. A middle-aged man entered, his leather jacket covered in road dust, likely a truck driver stopping for a break. Ethan watched him for a moment before turning back to his coffee. He decided not to let today's events burden him any further. The only thing he could control was how he faced it. After finishing his coffee, Ethan stood, pulling out his wallet to pay. The server looked at him, still smiling. "Thanks for stopping by. Take care of yourself." Ethan smiled in return. "Thank you. Have a good day." He stepped out of the diner, the cool afternoon air washing over him like a breath of fresh air. His car was parked just outside, gleaming under the fading sunlight. Ethan knew the road ahead would hold more challenges, but he also knew that he was strong enough to overcome them. As he sat behind the wheel and started the engine, his mind felt lighter. The car rolled forward, carrying him away from the events of the day, leaving behind a valuable lesson and a firm belief in justice. No matter how slow it may come, it will always show up. Ethan Carter sat in the open air of the park, the early autumn sunlight filtering through the green and yellow leaves, creating a peaceful scene that was a stark contrast to what had transpired at the gas station. In front of him was a young reporter, her sharp yet warm eyes, her pen poised to capture every word of his story. Ethan took a deep breath, still feeling the weight in his chest. "Your question isn't easy to answer," he began, his eyes thoughtful. "I want to believe that things like this don't happen often, that this is just an isolated incident. But the truth is, for people like me, this is not uncommon." The reporter tilted her head, her eyebrows furrowed, concern clear in her gaze. "What do you mean?" Ethan paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say, words shaped by years of endurance. "I served this country. I sacrificed so much to protect the freedom and safety of its people. But every time I come back home, I'm treated like I don't belong here, just because of the color of my skin, the way I look, or because they don't believe I'm a real soldier." The reporter nodded slowly, her pen pausing as if to fully focus on Ethan's words. "That must be incredibly frustrating," she said softly. "Frustrating doesn't quite capture it," Ethan replied, his voice tinged with both pain and resolve. "It's a deep disappointment. It feels like my efforts and sacrifices don't matter. But at the same time, I know that staying silent will only make things worse." "What do you think about how the officers handled things that day?" she asked, gently shifting the subject. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the stern yet fair gaze of the officer that day. "They did the right thing," he answered. "They listened, assessed the situation objectively, and handled it fairly. That doesn't always happen, and I know I'm lucky. But there's one thing I can't stop thinking about." "What's that?" The reporter leaned forward, intrigued. "Chuck and his group," Ethan said, his eyes distant. "I wonder if they've really changed after that incident. Do they realize the mistake in their thinking, or are they just angrier and more stubborn now?" The reporter quietly jotted down notes, then looked up at Ethan. "What do you hope will come from this story?" Ethan smiled, a sad yet resilient smile. "I hope it makes people think. Not just about me or other soldiers, but about how we treat each other. We're all human, we all have our own stories, and I hope this helps someone. Understand that sometimes, all it takes is pausing for a moment to listen and see others fairly. That could save a lot of pain." The interview lasted almost an hour, with Ethan opening up about his time in the military, the struggles he faced as a black man in America, and his hope that his story could spark a broader conversation about discrimination, prejudice, and respect. When the interview ended, he sighed with relief, as if lifting a burden that had been weighing on him for far too long. As the story concluded, the room fell into a quiet stillness. The reporter smiled at Ethan, her smile filled with understanding and appreciation. "Thank you, Ethan. I believe this story will have a greater impact than you realize." A few days later, the article was published. It quickly spread through the community, sparking mixed reactions. Some people, especially veterans, reached out to Ethan, offering support and anger over how he had been treated. Others, still skeptical, began to think about the issues he had raised. In fact, the local veterans group even invited Ethan to speak at one of their major events. He agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to continue a conversation he believed was desperately needed. A few weeks later, as things began to settle, an unexpected visitor showed up at Ethan's doorstep. It was Bill, one of the bikers from the gas station that day, the one who had stayed silent during the confrontation. Bill looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes clearly embarrassed. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Bill said quickly, raising a hand as if to reassure Ethan. I want to apologize. I was wrong. We were all wrong. I didn't realize it at the time, but what we did was unforgivable." Ethan was silent, watching Bill for a long moment. The sincerity in the man's eyes made him believe that the words were not just a shallow excuse. After a brief pause, Ethan nodded. "Come in, let's talk." The two men sat in Ethan's living room. The air was initially tense, but as Bill began to open up, things slowly eased. He explained how the gas station incident had caused him to reconsider the values he had once held. Bill admitted he had been raised with biases he had never questioned until that day. "It's not just because you're strong," Bill said quietly, eyes on the floor. "It's the idea that my whole worldview might be wrong." Ethan listened, his face showing a mix of skepticism and empathy. He had heard apologies before, sometimes sincere, sometimes not. But this time, something in Bill's words made him believe. "I appreciate you coming here," Ethan said, his voice deep but genuine. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong." Bill nodded, his face reddening with embarrassment. "I'm trying to be better," he said, almost as if making a promise to himself rather than to Ethan. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour. When Bill left, they weren't exactly friends, but they had achieved understanding, a small yet important step. That night, Ethan sat in silence, reflecting on what had just happened. The pain from that day still lingered, but Bill's actions were a sign that change was possible, if people were willing to face their mistakes. In a world where prejudice and hatred often overshadow reason, moments like these, however small, are still light. Ethan knew that standing up for justice wasn't just a battle on the battlefield, it was a battle within the heart, within our thoughts, and in the minds of those around us. If this story has touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to follow for more inspiring stories. Thank you all so much for your continued support. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. There may be some small mistakes in the content creation process, and we hope you can overlook them. Wishing you all happiness, peace, and good health in life. Stay tuned for more.